Hello, and welcome back to another podcast episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation. I've talked a lot about self regulation and the importance of emotion regulation because emotions affect our ability to self regulate. It can either enhance self regulation when we're motivated, when we're engaged, when we're interested, or it can completely cripple it. So, we really need to start here with that emotion regulation. It's important to understand what emotions are, however. I find a lot of people don't actually know the difference between things like emotions and feelings. People are usually using these different terms interchangeably all the time. Most workshops I go to, no one really knows the difference. But there is a difference between, all of these different concepts. And understanding the difference can really help us understand ourselves better. It can better help us regulate our emotions. And this is important for kids too. So, if we're talking about managing emotions, we really can't skip past what emotions actually are and what they're for, because that creates two problems, right? Like kids who start thinking emotions are a problem, and then adults who think that our emotions are a problem and they start treating emotions as symptoms that they want to eliminate rather than signals to interpret, because that's essentially what emotions are. So we want to make sure we're understanding emotions on a really basic level for now. And then in future episodes, I will be getting into the nitty-gritty details of things like the specific functions of emotions, the role of emotions in prediction and behavior regulation, how they can help kids move from overwhelmed to informed, right? By those emotional experiences. So, starting with this foundation, I really want to make sure we're differentiating the different terms we're using. So let's start with affect. Affect is sort of the broadest umbrella term for any kind of emotional experience. It's sort of the general color or tone of our emotional or general sort of internal state, or our could be our energy signal, right? If we want to use the battery example, where is our battery at? So if someone walks into a room and you can just sense a general sort of positive or negative vibe from them, you're observing their affect, that vibe. Okay. So it's not usually something we think about. It's just our body saying it feels great or I'm feeling off, right? It's sort of like this background noise. It's less specific and conscious than a fully formed emotion, but it's the sort of foundational, pervasive aspect of experience. So, if we use the battery level on your phone, if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're stressed, if your affect is low or unpleasant, right? Versus if you're really well rested, you feel good physically, you had a good breakfast, your affect could be more on the positive side, right? So affect, or waking up, we hear that too, waking up with the wrong side of the bed, right? Affect comes before emotion. It's our brain's sort of raw read on what's going on inside in the body. Okay. Emotions are a subtype of affect. They're a little more specific, they're a little bit more flexible, they're quick reactions to what's going on either internally or externally from us. And any of those internal or external events that we think is important to our well-being. So it helps us survive, it helps us make decisions. They happen so automatically, these emotions do. And emotions include the changes physiologically in our body, like our heart rate. It affects the changes that we see in our thoughts, like worried thoughts, and includes our behaviors. What do we do in response to all of those things that are going on? Maybe we're yelling, maybe we're withdrawing or crying. So, really, emotions are the brain's way of making sense of the world really fast, and they help us react when something's important, like danger, or it could be success, or just, wanting to connect socially. These emotions are multidimensional, meaning they're involving those three main parts that I kind of just talked about: our physiological response, what our body does, right? So, like I already said, the racing heart, when we're scared, we would have that racing heart. We could be, I'm just trying to think of what else here, blushing if we're embarrassed. Maybe we're sweating if we're anxious. So that's the physiological reaction. The second one I talked about is our behavioral response, how we act, right? The fight, flight, where we might be trying to escape a scary situation. Maybe we're not making any eye contact. We're not talking. We're trying to avoid talking, right? We know fear is an emotion triggered by some perceived threat. And so that's involving those feelings of being uneasiness and attempts to escape. And third is our feelings. That's our subjective, internal, personal experience of an emotion. It's what we label, what we feel inside, like happiness or sadness or fear. So if someone says, I feel happy, they're describing their subjective experience of the emotion joy, right? So while emotions are fast and automatic and includes all of those three things, the body, our mind, and our behaviors, feelings are really when our brain slows down and reflect on what's going on to help us describe what's happening. It's our interpretation and label for what's happening. So after, a dog runs away and you feel safe, or you run away from the dog and you feel safe, now you're thinking, wow, I was really scared. That's a feeling. Okay. We will be getting into appraising emotions in future episodes. There's so many things to go through, but thoughts shape our feelings. Our physiological experiences shape our feelings, but they aren't necessarily the feeling itself. So a feeling isn't about the raw sensation of what we feel. It's about how we interpret or praise the sensation, right? That's what determines the meaning of what it is we're experiencing, and that can amplify or diminish the emotional experience, right? So, anxiety, for example, it can be influenced by how we think about and interpret anything that's going on in our body or outside of us. So that interpretation, maybe of a threatening stimulus, is what leads to an emotional state of anxiety. The thoughts we tell ourselves about the situation, oh my gosh, I'm going to go on this roller coaster and I'm going to die. What if it comes off the wheels, right? And we crash in. So our thoughts that we're telling ourselves, that's infusing the situation with some meaning. Fatality, danger. The physiological sensation may or may not be present, but our thinking about whatever, the situation is, whether it is something external or internal, and we label it as anxiety or panic, that's now going to influence how intensely it's experienced. But you could be in the exact same situation. Wow, that roller coaster looks like so incredibly exciting. We could be having the exact same physiological sensations. Our heart can be beating, right? We might feel butterflies in our stomach, but how we're thinking about it is changing the experience, right, of our feeling and the whole situation. Now, the amygdala is involved in the automatic generation of emotion and that initial first fear. It's sort of our first physiological response. That's where the raw energy, the raw signal that we're getting from our internal state or our affect, it originates in a specific immediate way. We don't have any sort of control over that first sort of fear, or that first sort of whatever's happening in our body and how our brain is trying to make sense of it. So the first fear, sorry, is just in the emotional brain. It's just automatic. We're not thinking about it. We have zero control. The prefrontal cortex, that's the last to develop. That's where we are thinking. That's where we consider things. That's where we give meaning to the situation. So it's huge in terms of self-regulation. So that prefrontal cortex, is its job is to regulate emotions, right? And so it's really going to influence how we're interpreting. Well, it does. It's where we interpret and respond to the amygdala's signals. So this is the second fear, right? So if our prefrontal cortex is like, no, the roller coaster is totally fine. I've already been on it a million times. Then we're probably not going to spiral into more worries, into panic. But if we think, oh my gosh, like, look, what's that squeaking sound? And oh my gosh, was that a rack? Oh my gosh, was that a loose bolt? I don't know, wherever our brain goes, that's the second fear. And now we're perpetuating the panic. And that second fear is really our thoughts and interpretations about maybe what's going on. Oh my gosh, my heart is racing. This must be dangerous, right? So it could be the physiological, or it could be, oh my gosh, it's really sounding rackety, right? Um, we could be telling ourselves this is panic. Maybe it's not about the roller coaster. It's just, oh my gosh, now I'm having a panic attack. I can't tolerate it, right? It's a cognitive message from that prefrontal cortex. Now we're getting caught into this sort of panic mode. Okay. So the system is never really gonna be able to take a pause unless the prefrontal cortex is saying, no, I totally got this. If the prefrontal cortex can say, no, it's not a big deal, I got it, I've been on the roller coaster a million times, the system will calm down, even if there's that initial adrenaline dump, right? That adrenaline dump might take a little bit of time to metabolize. So even if our heart rate is still going, we still have butterflies, if our prefrontal cortex can on its own, it's not other people convincing us that we're safe, it's the prefrontal cortex on its own, the nervous system will calm down. Okay, but hopefully you can see the difference with the emotions, which is everything that's going on in our body and our thoughts, our behaviors, feelings, our interpretation that we put on it. Wow, I've used a lot of words to talk about that. Moods now is similar to emotions, but they're less intense. They usually last for longer periods of time. Emotions are often tied to specific events, but moods are sort of more generalized and they don't always have a clear cause, right? And so mood too, you can just wake up on the wrong side of the bed, right? You could just wake up in a bad mood and not know why. Mood really affects how we see the world. If we're in a sad mood, everything might seem worse than it actually really is. So, mood we can see can really influence how we react and interpret a lot of different situations. It could be over hours, it could be over days, it could be over months or longer. So, feeling down or grumpy all day, even though nothing bad, quote unquote, has happened, that's probably a mood. So, affect is the background signal in our body, sort of our battery check. Emotions are our brain's quick reactions to things that are going on. Feelings are what we call those emotions, and mood is how we feel over that long period of time. Now, by focusing on emotions, we're really talking about that emotion regulation. Before, historically, they were considered these sort of independent, automatic, fixed action patterns. But we actually know that emotions are way more flexible, way more controllable, right? It's not some universal hardwired package that we just have to deal with. Emotions are constructed, and I am going to talk a lot about this. This is just laying the groundwork, but we're going to be going into more of the trickier complex things because there's so much to discuss, and I just want to make sure that I dedicate an entire episode specifically on how emotions are constructed. Again, very important for us to know so that we can manage them better. Really quickly right now though, emotions are neurobiological, they're psychological. Both of those constructions really help make sense of the internal, external stimuli, and they really guide our behavior towards adaptive outcomes. They're supposed to be adaptive outcomes, like run away if there's danger. So, neurobiologically, emotions originate in the nervous system. So, they involve those interoceptive signals or body sensations, our physiological arousal, and the neurochemical activation like norepinephrine in anxiety or dopamine in joy. Okay, so that's the neurobiological piece. Psychologically, we're interpreting those bodily cues using past experiences and we're using language. So, what a kiddo calls angry might be what another kiddo calls hurt, which might another kiddo might say sad. So the label reflects both biology and environment. Okay. There is an adaptive function. All emotions have evolved to help us survive, right? They signal needs. They're communicating something to help us mobilize action. They're not inherently good or bad. I hear positive, negative emotions, good emotions, bad emotions. It's just data. So emotions aren't things that we have or just things that we experience. Emotions do things. This is really important. So, this is where we start getting into the different functions of emotion. So, there's an evolutionary function, right? Emotions are meant to provide adaptive actions from our environmental cues to help us survive and thrive. There's something in the bush. How am I going to respond in case it's a predator to save myself? Okay, so there's that piece. There's a social connection, a communicative function. Emotions are a nonverbal communication system through our tone, our body posture, our facial expression. They help us build empathy. They help us understand other people's intentions. So here we're really working on building emotion communication skills to address this function. There's a decision-making function, right? It sort of serves as an evaluation system. It really helps us prioritize what matters. For example, anxiety tells us this might be dangerous. Joy might tell us this is worth doing again. This was awesome. So we're going to help kids explore what are those emotions telling us. We don't want to keep getting rid of them. And that's part of the problem that we're doing, right? We're trying to reassure them, we're trying to make them feel better, but we're never listening to the signal. And so they're never going to learn how to regulate their emotion if they have no idea what the signal is. There's also another function for motivation, motivation for learning. There's an attention regulation as well. We remember emotionally salient experiences better than non-emotional. Right next to our amygdala, which is, the watchdog looking out for danger 24/7, right next to that is our hippocampus. Our hippocampus is our memory stores. We hold on to those big emotional experiences. We remember them more quickly, more vividly, way better than other situations, right? Than other memories that we have. And usually the biggest ones are the things that were really scary. Okay. So that's why our body can start reacting before we even have any conscious awareness of what's going on. Now, emotions can really narrow or widen our attentional focus. Anxiety, for example, we know it narrows in that attention on threat, right? We are stuck in that emotion. All we see is any potential threat when anxiety takes over. Joy, however, it broadens our attention, it broadens creativity. So, if we're working with upset kids, we really need to consider how their emotional state is shaping what they can actually process. So, if they're all worked up and they're scared and we're bombarding them with more stimuli, they're only going to pick up, and process information that's going to confirm. Yes, it's danger, 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 danger. We're talking about it. See, it must be dangerous because we're talking about it so much, right? So, this is always why we got to start with regulation and not reasoning. Reasoning in the moment of it, big upset is never going to be helpful. Kids cannot process information in that moment. So we really got to understand what's going on in the function and what we can do to help in that moment. There's also an organizational function. From a very early age, emotions really help us organize social communication. It helps us achieve goals. It helps us process information cognitively. So it's closely related to the regulation of actions and action tendencies. Emotions drive behaviors. They are action urges. Anger prepares the body to fight or to protect. Fear prepares us to run away or hide, right? Or to fight if we have to, if we have to. So these are those action sort of tendencies. Sadness, it draws us inward, right? We need to go inward so we can go process. We need reset break. We just need that rest. And then we can seek out support. Kids don't often have the language for these urges, but their behavior is communication. So if they're not using their words, they're behaving, and that is communicating. So we really need to look at that. Now, emotions themselves are not behavior. We got to make sure that we're separating that, right? We want to normalize the emotions. All emotions are okay. It's the behaviors that we usually need to address, isn't it? It's not about, I want you to be angry. We have to have anger. That's important. But what you do with that anger, that's what we need to focus on. You can't punch your sister in the face if you're angry, right? We got to use the behaviors adaptively. So we still want to normalize the function, right? And the function of the behavior. We're normalizing the behavior. All emotions sorry, I'm mixing it up again. We want to normalize the emotion. That's the piece. All emotions are okay, but we need to start looking at that emotion-driven behavior. That's what we have control over. So we can normalize by saying things like, it totally makes sense when you feel disrespected. Your body wants to yell, it wants to slam the door, it wants to show people that you've been disrespected. So you're not disrespected in the future. That anger, it's doing its job. We just need to teach good tools to protect yourself in those moments so that people are actually going to listen, so that you don't actually get in trouble, right? So that's going to be important. Now, there's another important function we don't really focus on too much because we spend so much time talking about down regulating all of these unpleasant emotions. But there's a special place, a special power in those pleasant emotions like joy and contentment. They provide a psychological lift, so to speak, right? They just make us feel uplifted, more expansive. That lift broadens our attention, it broadens our thinking, it broadens our actions. So instead of narrowing our focus, which a lot of the unpleasant, emotions like anxiety or fear do, positive emotions really encourage that wider range of thoughts. Our actions are more inspiring, more pleasant, more creative, all of those things. So we want to really focus more on this process of broadening our perspective and those actions to help us build personal resources. It could be physical, intellectual, social. So we're expanding those resources. Positive emotions are going to directly contribute to building resilience. It's going to offer a protective factor against future negative events. Why can't we start focusing more on those instead of all of this breathing and down regulating stuff? Those pleasant emotions are going to help us grow and they're going to help us better handle any challenges down the road. So that's really important to think about too, right? We want to also remember that positive emotions aren't only experienced when life is easy, right? We think that, oh, if I'm just happy all the time, everything would be so much easier, right? We want to make sure we're looking at those positive emotions, even in highly stressful situations, because those positive emotions can really help us find meaning and purpose. And I always love going back to Viktor Frankl. I mean, he is just the epitome of everything that I'm talking about, right? He was a prisoner in Auschwitz during, Hitler's Germany. And he was around him. I know I talk about him a lot. If you've listened to my podcast a lot, I've talked about him. But if you haven't, it's important that, you understand who I'm talking about. But, all around him, people were dying. You can just think of the horrors that were happening in these concentration camps. But he still had gratitude, right? And so gratitude, even in the most terrible situation that I could even comprehend, fathom, he could find that balanced view, right? So even though all of this badness is happening, there's still something pleasant that we can still experience. So that balanced view, it really acknowledges the importance of both the positive or pleasant, I'd prefer to call them the pleasant and the unpleasant emotions in a person's life. So emotions aren't just the automatic reactions, right? Regulating them is a natural part of our emotional responses. The ability to understand and to manage those emotions is part of what makes up emotional competence and emotional intelligence. Emotions act as information that our body gives us, how we use that information through our cognitive processes, through our behaviors, and that shapes our experience and our ability to cope and our ability to build resilience. So if we interpret a new challenge as an opportunity, right? Like, wow, this is a really scary double black diamond. Oh, I'm going to take the challenge. This is going to be awesome, right? You're more likely to experience that run as a positive experience. You're probably more likely to experience pleasant emotions, right? You're going to be excited. You're going to be eager. You're going to be like, that was awesome. That can turn into effective problem-focused coping strategies if you come to a cliff or you come to a really tricky part, right? Because you've got these pleasant emotions going on, you're going to be able to navigate a lot better than if, on the other hand, you're seeing as a, oh my gosh, I can't do this and there's nowhere out. Oh my gosh, there's going to be an avalanche. I'm going to be back here and I'm going to break my leg, and blah, right? It just leads to this fear and this unpleasant disengagement focused sort of coping. And then you might just sit there and cry until somebody comes to rescue you, or you take off your skis and you walk down the mountain or bum slide down the mountain. You're not going to have a very positive experience. The whole way down, you're going to be just feeling terrible. You're not going to think flexibly. You're not going to enjoy the scenery around you, right? So we really want to make sure we're focusing on all of this. So I know I've talked a lot. My words have not flown smoothly today, but I do think it's important, to make sure that we're addressing things because we know things like anxiety disorders are strongly associated with difficulties in emotion regulation. Emotion regulation really is part of a lot of problems we see, even in terms of cognitive inflexibility in neurodivergent populations, for example. It really is, it limits us, it narrows our world. So that emotion regulation is not just responding to how our emotions are and the experiences that we have, but when we're using those unhelpful strategies like avoidance, we're just making it worse in the long run. We're increasing our distress. We're never learning that emotions are not dangerous. We're not learning that they're going to decrease on their own. It's going to impair other areas of functioning, like, our school or our friends. It becomes narrower and narrower and narrower, right? And so unpleasant emotions like fear, right? Or even little things like embarrassment, it just makes it harder for kids to learn new information and behaviors usually worsen. But when we're understanding emotions, and understanding the function and the signal and what they're trying to communicate, it gives us a roadmap. It gives us a roadmap to support kids and it gives them a roadmap, a compass, right? So our job is to help them read that compass. We're not going to try to get rid of it and ignore it or distract them from it. We need to help them. Okay, fear has shown up. Anger has shown up. What sadness has shown up. Let's read this compass. What is it trying to tell us? It's going to guide us in the direction that we need to go rather than just trying to make them feel better. The links between our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings is really important, right? That's why I keep talking about it because we know that those can be changed. Any one of those points can be changed, usually easiest to change our behaviors. So, all of this to say, the reason why I wanted to make sure that we had this episode is that with this understanding, it helps kids boost their hope that they can actually do something different, right? That they can change things because so many of, especially as they get into teenage years and adult years, they feel like I'm just going to be anxious forever. And then they start feeling hopeless and helpless. And then it turns into depression and it can go down a really negative spirally road when they're set in this permanent, I'm always going to be like this. But no, there are things that can be done. And it helps kids start untangling what's happening in those overwhelming situations. So we want to talk about that cycle that they can get caught into, that they can get stuck, because we can actively change our behavioral responses. And by doing so, we're going to change their brain's responses. We're actually going to change the pathways in their brain. So good psychoeducation is at the heart of being really successful in helping kids manage emotions, right? So we want to spend time focused on this. And I will be going through the functions and the signals and how we, different directions based on that compass. But I just wanted to make sure we're laying this down because without understanding this, they're never going to know why they need to do the things they do. And if they're not knowing the why and they don't have that, no learning is going to happen. Their brain is not going to change. So what do they need to know? Just to synthesize it back down for you. They need to know that thoughts, feelings, and actions, when left unmanaged, contribute to that cycle of anxiety. A trigger or a situation, it could be a thought situation, it leads to those emotional and bodily reactions, or vice versa. And the response, like avoidance or safety behaviors, provides short-term relief, but in the long term, just makes that anxiety worse. So having this really simplified model of a brain is important where we're explaining the amygdala part of the brain, the automatic emotion, it's the threat detection part of the brain, but it can be glitchy. It can be trigger happy, sending false alarms, false messages that there's danger, danger. But the amygdala is an experiential learner. It needs to learn that a perceived trigger is a false alarm. right? Not just from us telling them you're okay, it's not a big deal, your teacher's super nice, nothing bad's going to happen. No, they need to learn directly through experiencing the triggering topic, going up to that teacher and having the conversation themselves, or going onto that roller coaster and experiencing it themselves. The prefrontal cortex is involved in emotion regulation. Its job is to tell the amygdala, I'm okay, I can handle it. But it can only do that with experience. So, this is why exposure is so important. If they keep avoiding that roller coaster, they're never going to learn, I can actually do it. I can handle it, right? So they need to, it's not until they go on to the roller coaster. We can all tell all of our experiences all we want, but the amygdala is never going to learn until that kiddo has done it themselves. So that they can learn, I can tolerate anxiety. I can tolerate the uncomfortable feelings. I can tolerate the uncertainty. The brain will start to learn this, whatever big emotion comes up. Even though it feels terrible in the moment, I can handle it. So that process of what helps rewire the brain. Lots to think about. Hopefully, it wasn't too incoherent. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I will always have extra resources and explanations and homework and things like that in the show notes. If you found it helpful, definitely share it. Drop a review. That's always great too to get more exposure. But at the end of the day, help those kiddos be bold and courageous. And I will see you next time.